Somebody who needs to be part of the conversation of what does it mean if Biden is on the fall is the third party candidate, independent presidential candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, he has said many times, I'm the only one who can beat Trump. And now, maybe that's true out of the three, but polls show that there are a lot of people that polling-wise would have a chance against Trump. But Bobby is a target because he is a threat, I believe, to the Democrats. Some will say to the Republicans as well. But either way, he's going to get hit. And Vanity Fair did just that today. They brought out an article that goes back and rakes through Bobby's closet, and there's plenty of skeletons in there. And they got allegations of past sexual misconduct, personal misconduct. Kennedy has responded to the allegations, and he did something unusual, I think, in this day and age. The playbook is Trump's, right? Deny, 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 they're a liar, Vanity Fair's is fake news, blah, 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 right? Bobby did not deny them. He said, I'm not a church boy. I have skeletons in my closet. I am who I am. And you know what? That's good enough for me. You can find out what's happened in his past. I knew about it in real time. You want to know? You can know it's there. To me, I don't think those kinds of questions determine who should be and should not be leaders. I think it's about what he can do for you, not what you just think about him and his past. So I want to talk to Bobby about what's going on in the race and what it means for him, and he joins us now. Bobby, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Chris, happy to be here.
Do you believe Biden has to go, and do you think he does go?
I can't, I try not to make predictions, and I try not to do spin because it feels dishonest to me. But I think, if what KJP, his press secretary, was saying was that this was a bad night for him, and that could be true. If it is true, the way to dispel that is to do, is to come out in the open, do his own press conferences, do unscripted meetings, not only with George Stephanopoulos, but KGB said during that press conference, he's done 40 interviews over the last 6 months. I do 40 interviews a week. And you have a lot of, and not to just curated questions to friendly pundits, but to people who are very hostile to me, long-form interviews on podcasters that are exploring all different ways that I'm thinking. And, I think the American people deserve that. Town halls, debates, all of those kind of things, because this is the guy that we're entrusting. Take that call at 3 o'clock in the morning. And,
right.
When he's being pushed down, woken up out of his bed and pushed down the hallway, and he has to make a decision that's going to affect all of humanity and have tremendous consequences for our children. We need to have somebody who is, at the top of his cognitive capacity, who has mental acuity, has deep understanding of these issues that he can draw on. And I'm not sure that's it. The other thing that KGB said is, well, it doesn't matter if he's cognitively impaired because he's done such a great job over the last 4 years. Most Americans don't agree with that. Most Americans are fighting the worst inflation since the 1970s. They feel like they're being gaslighted. We have the biggest deficit, this ruinous deficit that's threatening that's threatening existentially our nation. We have the Sinaloa drug cartel running border policy. We have kids who can't get in a house for the first time in American history, a generation of children who's going to live worse than their parents. We have a chronic disease epidemic. We're embroiled in all of these wars. We're losing a war in Ukraine that they've been lying about. And, those issues. So I don't think he can run on that record. I think he needs to be able to come forward and assures that he can actually run the country and not just some anonymous men in lanyards who have never been elected and who appear to be calling their shots now at Washington.
Bobby, I think that there's a connection between what Vanity Fair was trying to do and some of what I've been hearing as I try to get a sense of the state of play by people who are in the analysis business and running numbers for different campaigns. Because when I look at your numbers, you know, and obviously you can find 10 different polls that tell you 10 different stories, but you have not been gaining as Biden starts to have more and more questions about him. Your numbers aren't popping, let's say that. And then I start talking to people, and then I see Vanity Fair, and it all seems to be part of a same fundamental misgiving, which is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not your typical Kennedy. He's a radical, and he has radical ideas, anti-vaxxer being one of them. You've explained your position here multiple times. I don't see you as an anti-vaxxer, but I understand the criticism. They're now calling out your VP choice, saying that she says that the government is satanically possessed. I don't believe that's a fair reading of what she said, but it doesn't matter. It seems that that's what they're doing with you, is that you are not a legit choice because you are a kook and your VP choice is kooky. What do you want people to know about that notion about you?
Well, I mean, I would say, Chris, you've been around politics long enough to know that, and you've seen what happened to Bernie Sanders, and you've seen what happened to people who challenge official orthodoxies, who challenge these power centers. There's never been a candidate in American history who has challenged, for example, the intelligence agencies and the CIA in the way that I have. I'm challenging the military-industrial complex, the big contractors, the big financial houses who I call out by name: BlackRock, Blackstone, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, the people who fund the Democratic Party, who fund the Republican Party. I'm calling out the pharmaceutical companies, the chemical companies, the big food processors, big ag, trillions of dollars that are at stake now, and people who do not want me in the White House. So these same corporations have given $3 billion to the DNC. The DNC has an unprecedented opposition research group that is digging up dirt on me. I'm having people called, you know, people that I attended a 12-step meeting with 40 years ago who are getting the call from the DNC. People that I had, you know, just literally hundreds of people looking for any shred of dirt about me. And then, you know, Vanity Fair gave them a dumpster to put all this stuff in. You can tell, you know, the quality of that research from the fact that they said that they did this story that I ate a dog, and they have a picture of me supposedly eating a dog. And of course, it's not a dog. And they said I was eating a dog in Korea, and that they had checked with experts, metadata experts, and identified it as Korea, and checked with veterinarians who validated that it was a dog, and it's a goat, and it's in Patagonia. And it's a river trip that I used to do on a big whitewater river called the Futalaifu every year. And it's a big, you know, kayaking trip that where that's what we ate. That's what everybody eats down there is goats. So, but, you know, the irony is Vanity Fair is the most persistent complaint against me is that I'm promoting misinformation, but that whole article is just a dumpster of misinformation. But that's what they're going to do. And we know they're going to do it. In fact, they say it in the article. We are going to destroy Robert Kennedy. So I think, but, you know, my feeling is that when I walk on the street, when I go through an airport, when I, you know, walk down the block, in any city in America, and the enthusiasm for my campaign, the huge crowds that we're getting that are undiminished by this. And I think they've seen it before. They know that this is what the mainstream media does. So hopefully they'll read it with a discerning eye.
Bobby, I want you to have a discerning eye, too, and look out to see if people seem to not be bringing their pets to rallies where you're going to attend or any speech you're going to give. Listen, I got to tell you, I'll take you at your word. I've known you a long time. But how crazy a world is this? Could you have ever imagined that you and I would be talking on television? You're running for president, a grand ambition, and I'm asking you about whether or not it's true that you ate a dog. Can you believe that that's where we are? That's what Vanity Fair wanted. That's where we are.
There is nothing about this conversation that I could ever imagine even a year ago. So, that you are where you are, that and we've known each other for, 20 or 30 years, that I'm running for president and that I'm being accused of eating a dog. No, I would not believe any of those things. I am a very adventurous eater, Chris. I think you know about that about me. I'll eat virtually anything. There's two things I wouldn't eat. Well, three. I wouldn't eat a human. I wouldn't eat a monkey. And I wouldn't eat a dog. I think I'd eat anything else, but I just couldn't bring myself to do those things. So it is a goat, and you are what you eat.
The GOAT, the greatest of all time? Is that what you're saying about yourself, Bobby Kennedy? Such arrogance. Listen, this is going to be the most important phase of the race, the next 3 or 4 weeks. There may be big cataclysmic change in the Democratic Party. This is a period of reassessment. I don't think people have to, but again, I think they get to make a fresh appraisal. You have a platform here to make a case to the American people, as do all the candidates. And I wish you well in that process. Thank you for coming on and answering the questions.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Always enjoy being with you.
Hey, thank you for watching. Please go to newsnationnow.com, newsnationnow.com, and you can find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button down below. Then you will get more of News Nation's fact-driven coverage.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you for joining our coverage here on NBC News Now. You didn't qualify for this debate as you didn't hit CNN's requirements of hitting at least 15% in 4 national polls or getting on the ballot in enough states. We should mention you hit 3 polls, but you didn't get on enough ballots. Without a presence on the debate stage, your long shot campaign seems to have just gotten longer. Will you qualify, do you think, for the September debate?
I think so. We actually did qualify for this debate. We were in 5 polls, including 4 won by CNN that had me over 15%. One of the companies, the Monmouth Company, that was one of the approved 12 companies by CNN, CNN arbitrarily threw that poll out, even though it had me at 17%. CNN did not want me on the stage. They made an agreement with the Biden and Trump administrations or the staff to keep me off the stage. I was the only one who qualified even slightly for for being on the ballot in enough states. I got 270 votes. I now have the signatures sufficient to get me on the ballot in states enough to get me 340 electoral votes. So I qualified, and by the way, neither President Trump nor President Biden are on the ballot in any state, and they are not the nominees of their parties. So this was really
Mr. Kennedy, I'm looking at some, Mr. Kennedy, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at some stats here that were given to me here, but it says even your own campaign says you're officially on the ballot in just 8 states. How would you get to 270 with 8 states?
Well, we have enough signatures to get on the ballots in other states, but they will not. Those states won't register us until, some of them until August. We're on, we have enough signatures. We're completely qualified. Most of them, we have 3 times the amount of signatures that we need. But the states, under their own procedures, do not register you until August. So they basically made it impossible. CNN chose criteria that we couldn't make. We got a lot closer than President Trump or President Biden. They're not on the ballot in any state.
Mr. Kennedy, what did you think of the debate tonight? Were you able to watch?
Yeah, I actually had a debate that I think 10 million people watched. We had a virtual debate where I was on the stage with President Biden and President Trump, and it was aired live on X. It was live streamed simultaneously with the debate. So what I thought of it, I thought it was depressing. I thought we have 341 million people in this country, and it was a debate about, that was filled with vitriol and the anger and the finger pointing, and none of it talked about, nobody talked about the issues that really concern Americans. There's now 70% of the people in our country. We've had a nuclear bomb go off in our middle class. In the administrations of these two presidents, 70% of the people in our country are not making enough money to pay for basic human needs. I run into people every day who are, elderly people who are splitting their prescription pills to make them stretch out for the week, mothers who are downgrading the ingredients to get out to the checkout line at the grocery stores. A young couple I ran into in New Hampshire who had a fight because they were arguing if their crying baby is $50 sick or $100 or $500 sick before they bring them to a hospital. Americans are not supposed to be suffering like that, and that has happened in these last two.
I do want to ask you an important question. At some point, your campaign team comes back to you and says, listen, this is just not going to happen, right? We're not going to get on all the ballots. You're not going to be the president. Who will you throw your support behind?
I'm not pulling out. What I said to President Biden is that right now I am the only one of the two of us that beats President Trump at a poll. So President Biden can't beat President Trump. But I can beat him, and the biggest polls are showing me beating President Trump. I beat President Biden 39 states to 11 states in a landslide. So I'm not the one who should be withdrawing from the race, and I'm not going to be withdrawing from the race. What I said is that I will withdraw. I'll take a spoiler pledge with President Biden that we'll both take a poll in October, and whoever of us is less likely to beat Donald Trump, that person will withdraw, and I will take that pledge.
Mr. Kennedy, we only have a minute. I'm not familiar with those polls, but I'll definitely look out for them. I do want to ask you, nobody on this planet, maybe few people, except for your relatives, know the importance of a vice president. You have chosen Nicole Shanahan to be your running mate. She was a lawyer from Silicon Valley. What qualifies her to be commander-in-chief?
Nicole Shanahan is one of the smartest people that I've ever met. She's an expert in an area that I particularly wanted people, which is AI, which is one of the greatest threats and the greatest challenges that faces our country. We can turn it into something very, very precious, or we can turn it where it will be a terrible peril for us. And the fact that we don't have anybody in our government who is an expert on that right now in the cabinet is, I think, catastrophic.
All right, Mr. Kennedy, we thank you for your time. We thank you for joining us.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.
One presidential candidate drawing significant support as an independent outside the two-party system, drawing significant support in recent polls, but nevertheless excluded from last night's CNN debate. That man is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was told that he did not qualify for CNN's debate despite receiving as much as 10% or more support in several recent polls. Now, RFK Jr. participated in his own programming during the debate, where he answered many of the same questions as Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And he joins Rising now. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Robbie.
It's our pleasure. Thank you so much for making time. First, give us your impression of what happened last night. So many in America are concerned about what they heard from perhaps both Trump and Biden, but in particularly President Biden. A lot of the concerns related to his age and mental fitness on display last night. Even, very hardcore Democratic staffers deeply concerned, talks of swapping him out. What were your impressions from the debate?
Yeah, I wasn't that surprised by his performance because, we've seen that kind of frailty from him before, but I think it was a bad look for America, the whole debate where the world's exemplary democracy, we're supposed to be modeling the benefits of democracy to the globe. And we have 341 million people in this country, and I think a lot of the world is probably asking, is that really the best that you can do? But I think that it was a particularly bad night for President Biden.
One of the hottest topics last night was the economy. A lot of Americans are really feeling inflation, struggling to pay rent and their most basic bills. And we've had a term from either of these candidates, and it seems that the working class of America is unsatisfied with both of their performance while in office and are ready for something different. Can you speak to how your position on the economy is different from what we heard last night?
Well, the force that's driving inflation, which I think everybody understands in this country, is this ballooning deficit. We now have a deficit that's $34 trillion. The cost of servicing that debt is larger than our military budget. And within 5 years, the cost of servicing that debt is going to absorb 50 cents out of every dollar we raise in taxes. Within 10 years, 100% of every dollar that we raise in taxes is going to go to servicing the debt. It's unsustainable, but President Biden and President Trump will not address that because they contributed disproportionately to it. Almost half the debt was run up by these two presidents. In fact, President Trump came into office promising that he was going to balance the budget, and he ran up an $8 trillion debt. He spent more money than every president in the United States history combined, from George Washington to George W. Bush, 283 years of U.S. history. And then President Biden is now on track to beat him. We're adding $1 trillion to the deficit every 90 days. And it's being driven by the war machine, which neither of them can unravel. It's being driven by chronic disease, which they presided over, this explosion of chronic disease, which is now absorbing 5 times our military budget, $4.3 trillion a year. That's our biggest cost. And neither of them has the capacity to do it. And then, we could eliminate tremendous amounts of waste in government using AI, using blockchain, but you never hear either of these candidates talking about those things. They're about to change all of our lives. They offer tremendous potential for our country. They're the path out of the debt. We need a new industry because we can't cut our way out of this debt. We have to grow our way out of it. We have to grow GDP. And that new industry has the best potential as AI and also blockchain. But we're driving those out of the country, and neither of these candidates ever talk about either the peril or the potential of those new technologies.
You said in an interview last night on News Nation that you would be open to replacing Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. Has any high-level Democratic official reached out to you since you expressed that openness? And do you expect them to, given how hard they've gone against allowing you to participate in their primary and excluding you from the debate stage?
No, I'm not holding my breath. We're running our campaign. We're going to be on every ballot by the beginning of next month. And, I think that the Democratic Party now, the superdelegates particularly, are controlled by the big corporate donors. And I think that those corporate donors would probably prefer to have Donald Trump as president than to have me as president. I think for the same reason that they didn't like Bernie Sanders. And I think I'm 10 times greater threat to the status quo than Bernie Sanders was.
And we should mention that you obviously were not in the debate last night. CNN said the criteria was going to be 15% support in 4 recent polls, kind of mimicking the debate commission's criteria, even though the debate commission has been thrown out, and Trump and Biden both said we're not doing that. And it seemed like actually they could make whatever arrangement with CNN they wanted. And you did have that level of support in at least 3 polls. It was as close as it can be. You've pointed out that if the criteria is you have to actually be qualified in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes, well, Biden and Trump aren't the official nominees of their parties yet. So how do they count? What do you make of the excuses to keep you out of that debate at a time where millions of Americans are expressing profound dissatisfactions with the 2 choices put before them?
Yeah, and it was arbitrary because CNN, we actually submitted 5 polls to CNN that qualified of me at 15% or over, including CNN's own poll from April. We submitted them Harvard-Harris poll, and CNN told us we're not going to count that company because we never do. We sent them a reel of their announcers talking about Harvard-Harris polls. So that was disingenuous. But on their list of the 12 qualifying polling firms was Monmouth, and we qualified on a Monmouth poll, and they arbitrarily threw that out. So they did not want me on this stage. I think it's bad for our country. I think, listen, President Biden was ridiculing Vladimir Putin because he won by 88% of the vote in Russia. And he said that Vladimir Putin won because he could control the media in Russia and because he wasn't letting his political opponents on the ballot. And that's the same thing that's happening here in this country. The Democratic Party is apparently going to sue me in every state. This is what we now have just learned. And they control the media. I mean, this is the first time in American history since my uncle cut the first televised debate in 1960. Since then, the debates have always been run by a neutral organization, but by the League of Women's Voters for the first 25 years, and for the last 25 years, by the Presidential Debates Commission. Either of those organizations, I would have gone on the stage, but they didn't want me on the stage, so they cut an independent deal with CNN. CNN made tens of millions of dollars from that debate, so of course they're in. Plus, both the campaigns are almost certainly going to feed tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars more in advertising to CNN. So the whole thing is this, corrupt merger of state and corporate power that I entered this race in protest of and fighting against. And it's kind of the worst example of you've got a media company that's owned by BlackRock, the biggest owners of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And they're some of the biggest donors to both the Democratic and Republican political party. They own all the military contractors, which are profiteering on the Ukraine war. BlackRock has the contract to rebuild what it destroyed with the government. And they own Pfizer and all the pharmaceutical companies that are paying for the advertising. So I think Americans look at this web of conflicts and see that, what's come out of it, which is the Biden and Trump duopoly. And they're saying, okay, this system is just rigged, and it's rigged to service these big corporations, these big billionaires. And that, that's the reason that 70% of the people in this country are making less than the cost of basic human needs. That's the reason that over the past 10 years, 1% of the top 1% of the population now controls more wealth, owns more wealth than the 60% of the middle class. What's left of the middle class, which is almost nothing. Americans are struggling today, and they're struggling because this duopoly is systematically stripping the middle class of its wealth and its equity and destroying the American dream.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's one of the things my mind immediately goes to when I consider 2024 and who to vote for. It's interesting to hear you say you're 10 times of a threat to the status quo. Compared to Bernie Sanders, I would say Bernie Sanders threatened the status quo precisely because of his positions on corporate power. I appreciate you sharing more of your positions on that. You alluded to pharmaceutical companies, which in the past you've called Big Pharma in the U.S. a criminal enterprise. We saw yesterday the Supreme Court turn over that sweetheart deal from 2007 under the W. Bush administration, when his DOJ said they had enough to criminally prosecute executives at Purdue Pharma who knowingly sold and pushed OxyContin, knowing that it would end up being addictive and becoming a street drug. And George W. Bush said, no, we're not going to do that. And the Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma for quite some time, agreed to pay just $6 billion, and there would be no further prosecution. Now we're in a position where a new administration could potentially criminally prosecute those executives at Purdue Pharma and have some repercussion for the opioid crisis that's caused over 200,000 deaths in the past 2 decades. What can we expect to see from an RFK Jr. presidency in cracking down on corporate power and the merging of corporations in the state in the U.S.?
Yeah, you're going to see a real crackdown. And those, the four principal pharmaceutical companies have paid $79 billion in criminal penalties and settlements over the past 15 years. So when I say it's a criminal enterprise, I'm not using that term hyperbolically. This is what they do, and as long as the penalties are, a mere $6 billion, those are rounding errors for the company. These are the biggest companies in the world now. This is the biggest industry in the world, and they look at that as the cost of doing business. I mean, I'll give you an example. Merck, around 2007, it released the Vioxx, and Vioxx ended up killing between 120,000 and 500,000 Americans of heart attacks. Merck knew that drug caused heart attacks and marketed it as a pain reliever, as a headache medicine, as an arthritis medicine, but it didn't tell its customers that it also could kill you. And I think a lot of those customers, if they'd had informed choice, would have said, oh, I could get a heart attack from this. I'm going to take an aspirin instead. And they weren't given that choice. And Vioxx knew it was going to kill them. We actually, during the litigation, we got spreadsheets from their bean counters that showed how many people they were going to kill, what the settlements would be, and then announced in a delighted way, we're still going to make a killing on this. So they made a double killing, and they knew they were going to do it. It was planned, it was premeditated, and it's premeditated murder. So somebody should have gone to jail, and until we start sending them to jail, they're not going to change their behavior. This is the way you make money in the pharmaceutical industry, and as you pointed out, we're now killing from opioids, overdoses mainly. 107,000 kids last year died in this country. And, I lost a friend on Friday to a fentanyl overdose. I lost one of my nieces during the COVID pandemic to an overdose as well. And we're seeing that, every family in this country is now touched by this. We're killing more kids each year, double the number that we killed in the 20-year Vietnam War, but every year, year after year. And these companies, it's now a lot of illegal imported drugs, but this addiction crisis started with Sackler Pharma and the Purdue family. And, there's now two wonderful documentaries that my wife and I have watched on Netflix, where anybody can go and see exactly what they did. And it was premeditated murder of hundreds of thousands of people, and they shouldn't get away with it.
In a similar vein, during your closing remarks last night at your debate on X, you talked about the lack of pride that young people have in this country. And we've also seen that the youth mental health crisis has been incredibly exacerbated over the past 5 to 10 years. And yet our country prescribes more SSRIs and anti-anxiety medications than ever. How would an RFK Jr. presidency approach the youth mental health crisis without relying on big pharma to just prescribe more drugs?
Yeah, I mean, my Peace Corps program or Moonshot program is going to be a series of wellness farms where kids can go, where there'll be no screens, no social media, no computers, where kids can go and learn the trades. The trades are the one jobs that are going to be immune from AI for the longest. People are always going to need a plumber to walk up your stairs for many years until they have robots doing it. If you need to fix your toilet or if you have an electric outage, somebody's got to crawl into your crawl space. AI is going to eliminate a lot of crap, but we're not teaching the trades anymore. And the federal government is not providing money. They'll pay for you to go to college, give you loans to go to college, but not to a 2-year or 3-year trade school. And we need to change that. But I'm going to have these farms where people will grow organic food so that we can have, part of the problem with the mental health crisis is we're mass poisoning this whole generation of kids. We have 1,000 ingredients in processed foods in this country that are illegal in Europe. We're destroying the soils. We're destroying the environment. We're destroying the health of our kids. When my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And the cost has risen from about 6% of our GDP to almost 19%. And it's destroying our country in so many ways. But most of all, it's destroying the morale, the mental health of our kids. And part of that is social media. There's so many, it's so difficult to be a kid today. And I have 7 children, and I see the pressures they're under. And they're feeling dispossessed, they're feeling alienated, they're feeling disconnected from community, from society, they're atomized, they're fragmented. And we have to go out as a nation and reclaim these children. We have to connect them to community again, to connect them to purpose, connect them to pride and hope. And that's what I'm going to do with these healing farms. I talked about it last night. I'm going to legalize marijuana federally. It's now legal in the state. I'm going to move it off Schedule I because even though most states now legalize marijuana, the federal government cannot collect taxes on them because it's Schedule I federally. I'm going to change that so the feds can start collecting taxes. That'll raise $8.5 billion. I'm going to use that money to start healing farms in rural communities all over this country. The biggest industry today in rural America is prisons, and I'm going to change that. I'm going to make it so we're going to have these healing farms. A lot of the people who are in prisons are nonviolent drug crimes. I'm going to move out into these camps, and you can stay there for free until you're healed, till you're ready to leave, and you're going to leave with a trade and a job. And you're right. The addiction, we have an illegal drug addiction in this country. We also have an addiction to these psychiatric drugs that are very, very little understood and may not be very effective. 120 million SRI prescriptions last year, 120 million benzo prescriptions. And then, of course, there's 120 million Adderall prescriptions because our kids all have ADHD now. And nobody's asking why, but we need to change that. We need to end the chronic disease epidemic by ending the exposures that are causing it. And we need to start treating and healing and reclaiming this lost generation of American kids. And we need to then get them into houses, because if they don't have houses, we don't have a middle class in this country. And the greatest economic engine in America, in world history, the American middle class, is being decimated because they do not have equity. And if they, no matter what kind of entrepreneurial impulse you have, if you don't have equity, you can't pursue it. That we need to get them into homes.
What is your pitch this morning to both Biden voters and Trump voters, to the person who supported Biden but watched what they saw last night and can't imagine voting to give that person 4 more years in office? What's your pitch to that person? And then what is your pitch to the Trump voter to win them over to the RFK Jr. camp?
Look, I'm already beating President Trump and President Biden among young people. I'm also beating them among independent voters, which is the largest voting demographic for the first time in American history this election year. Self-identified independents are about 43% of American voters versus 27% Democrat, 27% Republican. I have the greatest favorability rating of Trump and President Trump and President Biden. That means people would prefer to vote for me, but they're not going to vote for me, many of those Trump and Biden supporters, because they're scared that the other guy will then win. So they're voting out of fear. And, what I need to do over the next 4 months, Robbie, is to convince Americans that they can take a risk and vote out of hope, vote out of inspiration, vote out of faith in their future and pride in their country, rather than vote out of fear. FDR made this, this tremendous urging to Americans that with the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that was very wise. And if we succumb to fear, we're going to get more of the same. You know what's going to happen if President Biden or President Trump gets reelected? We're going to have more of the same. We're going to have more division, more vitriol, more anger, more debt, more wars, more chronic disease, and the continued diminution of hope in our country. And I'm offering something different. If I get elected, everything's going to change. Everything's going to change. And if people want that, if people want their America back, they should vote for me.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for joining Rising today. We do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. That was a good one.
Yeah. Joining me now is independent presidential candidate Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., and it is a pleasure to have him back on the show. It's great to see you, sir.
Soccer, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, we watched your real debate. It was garnered views by millions of people. We have some video from that, actually. And we wanted to talk to you a little bit about your decision to participate and to hold this event, which happened outside of the mainstream media system, which consequently was still watched by millions, and what it was like to be excluded then from the CNN debate, and why you decided to throw that independent event.
Well, there was 71% of the American people wanted me on that debate stage, and I qualified for the debate by the criteria. I qualified better than any other candidate. Let me put it that way, by the criteria that CNN established. We think that debate was an illegal campaign contribution by CNN to those two candidates. I don't know if the FEC will hold them responsible or not, since it's dominated by those two parties. But we thought Americans deserve another choice, and a view of the issues that really should be talked about, the issues that these two candidates will never talk about, the division in our country, which is tearing our country apart, which they can't address because they're feeding on it and they're products of it. This huge budget deficit that the two of them, $34 trillion, that is now threatening, its existential threat for our country. Within 5 years, 50 cents out of every dollar that we collect in taxes is going to go to servicing the debt. Within 10 years, 100%. And these two candidates can't talk about it because both of them promised to balance the budget, and both of them ran up the biggest deficits in history. They can't talk about winding down the wars because both of them are feeding into them. They can't talk about the chronic disease epidemic, which is now absorbing 5 times our military budget and has affected 60% of our kids. We're the sickest country in the world, and they presided over it. So they can't talk about ending the corrupt merger of state and corporate power because both of them are part of the swamp, and they can't talk about making government honest again. And I said this, Sager, during the debate, that the day I get into office, I'm going to issue an executive order that any federal official who lies to the American people will immediately lose their job. President Biden, President Trump can't do that. They were both up there telling lies. So I thought the Americans deserved something other than the debate they were going to get from CNN. And by the way, CNN during COVID, which was the most momentous and consequential political decision over the past many decades, the lockdowns that shut down all of our businesses, shut down our schools, et cetera, CNN was the biggest cheerleader for that. So I don't think Jake Tapper is really capable of confronting these candidates on the terrible consequences that those decisions had on the American public.
Right. Bobby, one of the things that we do, I appreciate, and obviously we genuinely wanted you to be on the debate stage, which we said in our coverage as well. I do think it was a very consequential decision to exclude you, given the fallout from that. I'm curious to get your reaction to President Biden's performance. I mean, do you think that he's currently fit to serve as president after the performance that he gave?
I don't think he's fit to serve as president. I think The thing that frightens me, Sagar, is if we're in a situation where he gets that call at 3 o'clock in the morning and he's woken up, he's got 6 minutes to make the decision about whether to retaliate and to unleash our nuclear power on the Russians, the Chinese. During that 6 minutes, he's being pushed down corridors and tunnels under the White House and the bunker by 5 or 6 Secret Service. And I don't feel, he's got to make a decision that's going to affect the lives of our children, that's going to affect the welfare of all of humanity.
Right.
And I want somebody who's on the ball making that decision. I don't know. Even I'll say this, Sagar, and I don't want to make this personal about me, but I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, and he's just a completely different person now. And even this little decision of him not providing me with Secret Service protection, I don't think the Joe Biden I knew would do that. I don't believe he's making that decision. I believe he probably doesn't even know about it, because I think he seems unaware. And I know that, Joe Biden has a bust of my father sitting behind him at the Oval Office. He knows what happened to my dad. And, he was the person I knew, that Joe Biden I knew was a decent man. He would not make this kind of decision. So what I think is there's somebody sitting there, some kid in a lanyard, some anonymous man in a lanyard, who's sitting with his feet up on the desk at the Oval Office saying, I'm the real president. Right. Nobody knows about it. But there's somebody else. I just believe that there's somebody else making these decisions, because I think that Joe Biden I know would not be making that kind of decision.
Bobby,
and
since you were
I can name a whole bunch of them.
Right. Well, but since you were the highest polling Democrat in the race, other than Joe Biden, before you decided to run as an independent, have any Democrats or major donors reached out to you to ask you to become the standard bearer and replace him?
We haven't heard from anybody yet. I'm sure they're looking at polls, and the polls we did, the Zogby poll, which is the biggest poll ever taken in this race, one of the biggest polls ever taken, 26,000 people. So the typical poll taker has about, by Quinnipiac or Harvard Harris or Gallup, has 1,000 to 2,200 people in it. This was a poll of 26,000, and it shows clearly that I'm the only person who can beat Donald Trump, including President Biden. If I'm in the race, President Biden loses. If I'm out of the race, he loses even worse. But in a head-to-head, me against Donald Trump, I win. In a head-to-head, me against President Biden, I win in a landslide. I win 39 states. He only wins 11. So my numbers, I'm the only candidate who can cut into Donald Trump's base. And if the objective, which I think is true, there's two parts of the Democratic Party. There's the donor class, which I think would like to keep me out of would rather have Donald Trump than me in office.
Okay.
And then there's the rank and file Democrats who are so terrified of Donald Trump that they would much rather have me as their candidate, because I'm the only one who can win.
Is it something you would even consider, Bobby, at this point? You've run as an independent, you've picked your vice president. Would you even consider running for the nomination at the DNC if they were offered it to you?
I think that because me running as an independent is going to cut away from votes, or the Democratic and Republican parties. So the clearest path for me to the White House is through the Democratic Party. I don't have to do that, but I think that would be probably the best choice for everybody, and it's certainly something that I would consider.
Well, I'm curious to then find out, because one of the things that you're often accused of is being a MAGA sympathizer or some sort of agent for Donald Trump. What did you disagree with about Trump most on the debate stage?
Well, I think Donald Trump was a terrible president. I think a lot of the things he talks about winding down the military-industrial complex. But he didn't do that. He gave the first $1.5 billion to Ukraine to buy for the first time offensive weapons. He was the one who sent Pompeo over there in 2019 and said, we're going to extend NATO into Ukraine. And he walked away from the intermediate nuclear weapons treaty unilaterally with the Russians. And if you look at the way he governed, he said he was going to drain the swamp. He brought a pharmaceutical industry lobbyist in to run HHS. He brought oil lobbyists in to run the Interior Department. He brought a coal lobbyist in to run EPA. He brought a Verizon executive in to run the FCC. He brought a banker in to run the Treasury Department. And so, and he brought John Bolton in to run the NSA, and he brought an oil executive in to run the State Department. So these are swamp creatures. He wasn't draining the swamp. He was turning the government over to corporate pirates. And so everything he did in governing in that way, I think a lot of the rhetoric that he talks about, I agree with. I think we need to wind down, the swamp. But he wasn't doing that. I don't think he's capable of governing, of meeting the expectations and fulfilling the promises that he raises with his rhetoric.
Returning then to the possibility of running as a Democrat, do you still think that? One of the criticisms I've seen is that you're too far apart from the Democratic Party. Do you think that you're in line with the majority of Democrats? On several of these issues.
I think that I am the classic Democrat. I'm a Kennedy Democrat. If you go down a checklist of all of the important priorities for my father, my uncle, I would check off every one. Protecting our Constitution, protecting our Bill of Rights, decoupling corporate control from our regulatory agencies, which have become sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate. Winding down the war machine, using diplomacy instead of war, all of the things, personal freedoms, medical autonomy, bodily autonomy, all the things that the Democratic Party has traditionally represented and fought for, those are the issues that are my priorities.
Bobby, what did you make of the Supreme Court's decision yesterday on presidential immunity? Is that something you agreed with or disagreed with?
I think it's horrifying. I think, I'm not partisan about this. It helped Donald Trump, but that's not what I care about. I care about the fact that we now, the executive now has this enormous power that I don't think was contemplated by the framers of our Constitution. And I think it, in the hands of Democrats or Republicans, at some point, our country is going to land in the hand. There's going to be a demagogue who is occupying the Oval Office, and the tools and the weapons that the Supreme Court have now put at that person's disposal are they're breathtaking. And I think it would be challenging for our democracy to survive in any form that we recognize if those every power that an executive is given will ultimately be abused to the maximum extent possible. And I think, I think we all have to contemplate what happens when you unleash executive power to that extent. And I think it's very, very alarming.
Bobby, what will your criteria be for appointing a SCOTUS justice? I don't believe I've seen you expound on that before. Like, what would you look at in terms of Roe versus Wade, let's say in terms of Chevron, this immunity case, and others? How would you evaluate, considering that the next president is likely to appoint at least 2 Supreme Court justices to the court?
Yeah, Sager, it's hard. I would really evaluate based upon character and a commitment to the Constitution. Chevron cuts both ways. Chevron was really, I spent 40 years in the trenches fighting both, suing administrative agencies,
right,
and also suing large corporations. And Chevron was an important weapon for us because it gave the regulatory agency the capacity to fill the kind of interstitial places in the statutes that Congress just will never answer. And now that is gone, and every decision by the regulatory agency can now be litigated, which is going to enormously weaken the regulatory agencies. Chevron was a two-edged sword, because when the regulatory agency becomes captured by corporations, it also functions to widen corporate power. So unfortunately, I think we're in a place in American history where, I'm kind of neutral on the Chevron issue, because I see the really good things that it did in the past, but I also see the very bad potential that it has right now, where we're living in a situation where our regulatory agencies are just indentured servants and really subsidiaries of the corporations that they're supposed to regulate.
Returning to the campaign issue, if the Democrats do swap out Joe Biden for somebody else, would there be a criteria? What would your decision-making process be? Would you possibly drop out of the race? Are you going to stay in this race no matter what, unless it's you? How would you evaluate that scenario?
Oh, I'm going to stay in the race. I think, unless they appointed somebody who shared exactly, all of my ambitions for the government for dismantling the.
Is there anyone not you that you could point to that represents somebody like that?
Not among the contenders. I think we all know who the contenders are. There's 6 or 7 people who they could pick. And I think among those people, there is nobody that would lead me to drop out of the race.
Let's say that probably the most likely is the current Vice President, Kamala Harris. If you were up against her, what would your campaign message be as to why you're better than Kamala Harris?
I think Kamala has the same issues that President Biden has without the sort of cognitive issues, is that she's very pro-war. She's supported censorship. She supported this unprecedented assault on our Constitution, where they closed all the churches for a year without regulatory process, without scientific citation, without public hearings or notice and comment rulemaking or environmental impact statements or anything. All of the other issues, shutting down jury trials, the Seventh Amendment, closing 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. The Constitution is critically important right now, particularly, Sagar, because you have the rise of all these very intrusive surveillance technologies like AI, like facial recognition systems, like low-altitude satellites that can look at every inch of the world every day, digital currencies, all these things that can be used, number one, by corporations to maximize their profits and to commoditize us all, and commoditize everything we think or do or say to each other in every interaction. But also they can be used by government to surveil and control the populations, and to actually, with AI, to alter our reality and really ultimately control our minds. I think it's really critically important at this point in history to raise the bulwarks, the barriers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, to make them impervious and impermeable. And I don't think that that's something that Kamala really grasps.
What's your plan for the next ABC News debate scheduled in September? I'm sure you've looked at the qualifications, any legal, ways that you'd be able to get on the ballot, perhaps by suing ABC. Have you been in contact? Tell us about that, because that possibly could be even more important than the previous debate that we just saw.
Yeah, we're hoping that they let me on the debate stage this time. So, I think I'm going to qualify by all the traditional, I will be on the ballot in every state at that point. And my poll numbers are good enough. And if the Presidential Debating Commission, if they were still running it, I would definitely be on the stage. So, I need to look at their criteria and how that was selected, and then, make a decision about what to do. Unfortunately, Sagar, the FEC, Federal Election Commission, is very weak agency. It's unresponsive. It's captured by the political parties. So it is another captured agency, and the parties it's supposed to regulate. Interestingly, the Gallup poll came out this week that showed that independent voters are now by far the biggest political demographic in our country. 51% of Americans self-identify as independents. Only 23% say they're Democrats, 25% say they're Republicans. So you have these two minority parties who are running our whole political system, and most Americans do not feel like those parties represent their interests. I'm doing better among independents than either President Biden or President Trump. And it's kind of a joke to say that those voices should not be represented on the national stage. And I think we have to make that point. I'm grateful to you and to this show for giving me, an alternative narrative that is, I think, the closest to the truth of what's happening in our political system right now, because the mainstream media is also, has been captured by the Democratic.
Well, we appreciate that, sir. I mean, it's very obviously ridiculous, not to have one of the highest polling independent candidates in decades not on the stage. And I think it genuinely could have changed history. Ryan Grimm made that point on our show, because you would have been the contrast to President Biden as opposed to just President Trump. This does matter, though, in the ballot context. So as of 6 days ago, for your campaign said you're on the ballot in 8 separate states. So you said you're going to be on the ballot in you have an account for only 138 electoral votes. That's currently. But you said just now you're going to be on the ballot all 50 by September. Can you assure us of that? Because as I understand it, there have been some ballot challenges and others. Tell us about that process, as it's arguably the biggest obstacle to your campaign right now.
Yeah, I mean, people say we're only on the ballot, I think, in 8 or 9 states, which is true. But we have enough signatures to get on the ballot in more than half the states already. And they're all the hard states. So the easy states that, are the ones that are left, and we will be on all those ballots by the end of this month. We're not going to be, let me edit that remark.
Sure.
We won't be on the ballot because there are many of these states where the state will not let you get on the ballot, even if you have all the signatures. They won't process your application until the end of August.
I see.
So we have, in most states, we have 2 to 3 times the number of signatures that we need. And these are not going to be susceptible to any authentic challenge. The DNC is probably going to make frivolous challenges to us in every state. So far, we've won every single one of those lawsuits. We have now a war chest to fight those lawsuits against the DNC, and we're going to fight them all. But we will have all the ballot signatures that we need by, as I said, by the end of June or the end of July, or the end of June or the first week of sorry, I'm getting mixed up about what month I am. I think it was in 3 weeks. Okay. By the 3rd week of July, we'll be on the ballot. We'll have enough signatures to get on the ballot in every state.
And this is critical because, as I understand it, this is part of the way that CNN excluded you from the debate, is even though you had the ballots to qualify, even though you technically weren't on the ballot, they were saying that you didn't, even though, as you pointed out, President Biden and Trump, neither of them are officially on the ballot either, because neither of them have actually been nominated. So that was a real view, I think, into the way that the current process is rigged. I'm curious on your fundraising numbers. Have you seen a major increase? I believe your campaign just said you've raised $46 million. Currently, about $10 million of that from your vice president. Can you give us any insight into post-debate, considering the amount of political interest that's spiked in this country since?
I honestly don't know the numbers. I do know this, that on the day of the debate that we had a record day fundraising. And I've heard, but I can't guarantee you this. I've heard that the fundraising has been very, very good since the debate.
Okay. All right. Well,
and I think, and the other thing is that, the political parties can raise over $1 million per donor. And we're restricted to $6,600 per donor. But because we are now on the ballot for existing political parties, the Natural Law Party, the We the People Party, or it gives us now the capacity to raise that limit to $47,000, maybe $43,000 per donor. So it allows us now to go back to our donors and our maximum donors and tell them that, that there's a new maximum. And so I think our fundraising is gonna be fine.
All right. Last question for you, sir, because I know that you're running on a short time. Vanity Fair came out with a major profile today. I want to give you a chance to respond to this. There's a photo circulating, I believe, of you posing with what looks like a dog, and also a barbecued dog. I'm not going to show the picture as a dog lover. I know you have pets yourself, and also a sexual assault allegation from one of your former nannies. So I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah. Sorry. The article is a lot of garbage. The picture that they said is of me eating a dog. It's actually me eating a goat in Patagonia on a whitewater trip many years ago on the Futalaifu River. They say there's an expert. They have an expert that has identified that as a dog carcass.
Yeah.
It's just not true. So, and in terms of the other allegations, I've said this from the beginning. I am not a church boy. I am not running like that. I said I had a very, very rambunctious youth. I said in my announcement speech that I have so many skeletons in my closet that if they could all vote, I could run for king of the world. Mm-hmm. So, this Vanity Fair is recycling 30-year-old stories, and I'm not, going to comment on the details of any of them, but I am who I am.
You're talking there about the nanny situation. I mean, I do have to ask, sir. I mean, are you denying it or not?
I'm not going to comment on it.
All right. Well, I gave you the opportunity, and officially, it's a goat. I didn't know necessarily about what did they say? It's a spare rib of a canine. I think that's what they said for their identification. But we've got it from you. I'll let the anatomy experts be the ones who can determine that, sir. I very much appreciate you joining us for these questions. It's been a big interview for us, and we wish to see you on all 50 ballots and including on the debate stage, because that's what the American people deserve. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sager.
Absolutely. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show. Help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.
Wow, I'm so glad they put up these barricades. Yeah, I don't like you that much, From a distance, you're okay, but that's it. No closer. Okay, as you know, Socrates in the City is a forum where over the years I have interviewed the candidates for the highest office in the nation. And it's not a laugh line, if you don't mind. I've asked each of them, from Pat Paulson, Shirley Chisholm, Dick Gephardt, all through the years, I've asked each of them, who the hell are you? Excuse me, who are you to think that you would dare be president of the United States and hold the same office as Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Lincoln and Biden? Okay, you know I'm kidding. This is not, we've never ever here, I've never interviewed anyone running for office, much less running for president. We do not do politics at Socrates in the City. We ask the big questions, what we call life, God, and other small topics. And tonight, thank you. And tonight, I have the privilege of having a conversation with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about his life and about America, past, present, and future. If you followed Socrates in the City over the years, you know that I have interviewed astronauts, men who have walked on the moon, men and women who have not walked on the moon, and everything in between. Think about that. We've interviewed poets, novelists, scientists, theologians, TV stars like my friend Dick Cavett. Now, I should say the closest we ever came to doing politics here was about 15 or 17 years ago when my guest was Governor Mike Huckabee, but that was not to discuss anything political, but it was rather a conversation to explore the intellectual themes set forth in his book, Guns, Grits, and Gravy. And by the way, no, that book did not win the Pulitzer Prize. But on the upside, it was also not ghostwritten by Ted Sorensen. So anyway, we take the higher intellectual path at Socrates. This will not be a hard-hitting journalistic interview, although many people do think that I look and sound a little bit like George Stephanopoulos and a lot like Christian Amanpour. Thank you. Thank you. So there'll be no hard-hitting journalistic questions, nor do I approve of asking flippant questions of someone running for president. I will not, for example, be asking the question, boxers or briefs. Incidentally, Joe Biden was asked that question recently, boxers or briefs. His answer, depends. But in all seriousness, we stick to intellectual themes at Socrates. Sometimes the discussion can turn literary. Tonight, I will, among other things, be tipping my hat to Dante Alighieri by asking our distinguished guest what level of hell he believes Anthony Fauci will be consigned to. And that, excuse me, it's a strictly literary question. I put him down with Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, you know, encased in the ice. That's just, we'll see what Bobby has to say. Now, I have to be upfront. It was a challenge for me to agree to this interview. That's because while I sincerely admire Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Very much, I have nonetheless been very public and very vocal in my support of Joe Biden. I'm just a Biden guy. I have always been a Biden man ever since that night when I sold my soul to the devil. It was at a crossroads at midnight under a full moon. There was a dead cat involved. And I remember we summoned the ghost of Corn Pop. Anyway, in keeping with the promise I made to Lucifer that night, I wouldn't want to be, by having this forum, want to be seen as giving aid and comfort to anyone challenging Joe Biden. All right, a word on the RFK Jr. moniker, right? I just have to say, with a name like Metaxas, a lot of Greek names and stuff, I don't understand why Kennedy needs to be shortened. It's a pretty simple name. Is it too complicated? No. Of course, I trace the negative trends in our history to when this happened. You got JFK, you got RFK, then you get LBJ. Before you know it, you have J-Lo and AOC. And I just want to know, I want to ask, Mr. Kennedy, are you proud that your family, of this legacy of bringing, for example, K-Fed into American culture? All right, I think we better get serious for a second here. It is genuinely my honor to have as my guest this evening to talk about America, past, present, and future, my esteemed guest, RFK Jr. Please welcome him. There he is.
Thank you, everybody.
I have a million questions I want to ask you. I want to start, let me just say, can I throw you an easy one, real easy? What's the capital of North Dakota? It's only easy if you know it. Bismarck. He knew it. Bismarck. For a Kennedy, that's a softball. I knew he would know that. No, I want to start. I mean, 2 days from now, there's going to be a debate on CNN from which you have been excluded. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And do you feel that? Well, yeah. What are your feelings? Because I have to say, that was big news when I read it, and I'm glad you could be with us tonight.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Eric. I've looked forward to talking with you. I've been an admirer of yours for a long, long time, and I'm very, very grateful to be here with everybody. A few thoughts about the debate. One is that CNN, we know from the Washington Post and other reports that CNN met with President Trump and President Biden, and that they all agreed that I should be excluded from the debating stage. There's an FEC rule that says that kind of collusion is illegal, that the networks can stage a debate, but they have to have pre-established and neutral criteria to determine who gets on the stage. And is not intended to exclude a particular other campaign. And otherwise, the debate is an illegal campaign contribution, which I would argue this debate is. They established criteria. The two exclusionary criteria that they established was one, that all the candidates any candidate to get on the stage must be on enough ballots in enough states to get 270 electoral votes. And I'm the only one that comes close to qualifying for that, because I have enough signatures now to get about 340 electoral votes. And neither President Trump nor President Biden is on the ballot in any state. They have an expectation that their parties are going to nominate them, and then they will be on the ballot. But at this point, they are not. The other criteria they used was CNN picked 12 polling companies. It excluded the most important polling company, which is Harvard-Harris, which has got me about 18%. And it chose 12 polling companies and said that anybody to get on the stage needed to have a 15% minimum and at least 4 polls from among those companies. And we submitted to CNN 6 polls. They excluded the Harvard-Harris poll. They excluded one, and one of those polls, by the way, was a CNN poll that has me at 16% from last month. And they excluded, at the last minute to get me off, they excluded or just arbitrarily, a poll from Monmouth, which was one of the companies they designated, and that poll, I think, has me at 17%. And I don't mean to sound like I'm griping, because I'm not, but this is something Americans should be concerned about, because they had to get rid of the Presidential Commission on Debates, which has been operating all the debates since 1988. The first debate was my uncle's debate in '60. And since then, there has never been a private company that has owned the presidential debate. It's never happened before. This year, in order to get away from the Presidential Commission, which would have put me on the stage, they cut a side deal with CNN, and it looks fishy.
Who cut a side deal?
The Biden and Trump campaigns. And they said during that conversation, both campaigns said, we want to keep Kennedy off the stage. And this is reported by the Washington Post. And but it looks particularly fishy, because both of those companies are going to get tens of millions minimum and probably hundreds of millions of dollars, or both of those campaigns are going to contribute tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to CNN. And so it's a conflict of interest, and it really is just a long campaign commercial for those two campaigns. And the other thing I would say about it is that CNN, the most consequential political decision over the past, during those two administrations, had to do with COVID. And the lockdown of our country for 500 days, which both President Trump and President Biden went along with. And that decision shifted $4.3 trillion from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of billionaires. They created a billionaire a day in 500 days, 500 new billionaires. And they shut down 3.3 million businesses. They shut down all the churches with no due process, no just compensation. They shut down jury trials in violation of the Seventh Amendment for anybody injured by a countermeasure. They shut down the Fifth Amendment guarantee of due process and just compensation when somebody closed your business and injured your property value. And they shut down freedom of speech, both of them. So the government started actively censoring for the first time in history, pressuring social media and media companies not to publish critiques of their policies, their political decisions. This was very, very consequential for our country, but the biggest cheerleader was CNN. Oh, Jake Tapper was out there shaming people who, violated mask mandates or who weren't staying in their homes or who weren't getting weren't submitting to the medical interventions that they were demanding. And I feel like somebody should be on that stage asking all three of them about their role in it, not just President Trump and President Biden, but the role of the media, which completely collapsed during COVID. Louis Brandeis said, the role of the media in a democracy is to maintain a fierce posture of skepticism toward government authorities and toward official pronouncements. And that was what the media did in this country for the first 285 years of our existence. But in the last decade, and particularly culminating in COVID, you saw the media completely take the opposite posture. The media became the mouthpiece for government policies. It shamed people who dissented from them and disagreed. It silenced them, it marginalized them, it gaslit them. People who said that they had an injury from one of the interventions, people who complained about the impacts of their children on the school closures, people who said, you don't have any evidence that masks are actually based on science or social distancing. Those people became heretics and had to be silenced and discredited and burned, and the media was leading that rather than being skeptical towards government authority. So, I think it's disturbing, the exercise. We're going to do a kind of a live stream that includes me in the debate on X.
So while the debate is happening on CNN, you're going to do. Describe it again. You said
we're going to do a live stream that will have me at a podium. It'll kind of look like I'm on this stage with them. But CNN has said this is proprietary, and we're going to sue you if you do that, and we're going to do it anyway. There's never. And Elon, who's supporting us on this.
You're talking about Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Because he and I are not on a first name basis. I just want to be clear.
Yeah,
I know you'd assume that.
There's only one Elon.
But yes, I know. So far.
Yeah.
So far. So you're going to be doing something during the debate where you're doing commentary. It's like a little bit like Mystery Science Theater. What?
I'll be answering the questions.
But how are you going to find time? In other words, I'm not clear on how that's going to work.
This is the miracle of technology. There'll be a slight delay, but we're going to catch up with them there's two breaks, and so.
Okay.
It'll be. We don't know if we'll pull it off, but we're going to do it.
Do you feel? I think. I think it strikes me that, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you is because you've been very bold in saying things that, quote unquote, you're not supposed to say. And as you just said, the mainstream media has been, I mean, complicit is actually a nice word. They have been profoundly guilty, really, in going along with certain narratives. It seems to me because of that, not just CNN, but the mainstream media, so-called, has effectively been censoring you. They particularly dislike you because you've taken them on. So I want to ask you, I mean, to respond to that, and also to talk about where do you get that from, that idea that you're going to be talking about things, even going way back to speaking critically of vaccines. What's the provenance of that kind of thinking on your part?
Let me answer the first question and then get a clarification from you on what the second question is. The first question is, I've been censored for many years in a way that's not illegal. It's corporate censorship. There's two kinds of censorship. One is I was saying things beginning in 2005 when I started talking about vaccines. And by the way, I got dragged into that controversy kicking and screaming. It's not something that I wanted to do. I got there because I was litigating at that time in about 40 suits. Again, I'll go back a little. In 2003, the National Academy of Sciences and the FDA joint published a study that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh.
I'm sorry, every what?
Freshwater fish.
Every freshwater fish.
Yeah, it had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. So I was at that time the founder and leader of the biggest water protection group in the world, and it was started by commercial and recreational fishermen here on the Hudson, but it spread so that we had 350 patrol boats on waterways all over North America and 46 other countries. And this report really shook people up because we knew there was a lot of mercury in tunas, but this is all the freshwater fish, literally.
Well, you know, and tuna is not a freshwater fish.
That's what I'm saying. We all knew about tuna and swordfish.
Right.
Those are saltwater predatory fish.
Right.
People didn't know about, that largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, brim, crappie, yellow perch, white perch.
I mean, I've
muskie.
literally never heard this until now.
Yeah, every freshwater fish that they tested.
Yeah.
So we started, and the mercury was coming from coal burning power plants. Some of it was coming from mining in the western states, but most of it was coming from cement kilns and coal burning power plants. So I had about 40 lawsuits in Canada and the United States against those plants for emitting mercury. And I was lecturing around the country, trying to get legislation, et cetera. These women would show up at every one of my lectures, and they weren't the same, they were different, but they would always arrive early, they'd sit in the front seats, and then afterward they'd come up to me, and they were always very well dressed, very well spoken, and very well informed, and they would tell me in a very respectful but vaguely scolding way, if you really are concerned about mercury exposures to children, you need to look at vaccines. And as it turns out, they were all the mothers of intellectually disabled children who they believed had been injured by the vaccines, mercury or aluminum in the vaccines. And
you said intellectually disabled, so not just autistic or on the so-called spectrum.
They had all kinds of intellectual disabilities, but a lot of them were related to autism. They're ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. The autism rates had expanded dramatically. My generation, 70-year-old men, the autism rate is 1 in 10,000 today, right now. The autism rate in my children's generation is 1 in every 34 kids, 1 in every 22 boys. And it's higher in states like New Jersey and Utah. And I've literally never seen anybody with full-blown autism my age by full-blown autism, I mean nonverbal, non-toilet train, head banging, stimming, toe walking, hand flapping, never seen it. And I've been around intellectual disabilities my whole life. My Aunt Eunice Shriver was the founder of Special Olympics, and I worked in Camp Shriver, which became Special Olympics in 1968. I worked as a hugger and a coach from when I was 7 years old. Every weekend, I worked for 200 hours in Wassaic Home for the Retarded up in near Pauling, New York, when I was in high school. And so I was around this as part of my family DNA. I never saw anybody who had anybody during my early years who had autism. It just started appearing, and it went dramatically appeared. In fact, Congress said to the EPA, what year did the autism become an epidemic? And EPA came back. And EPA is a captive agency, but it's captive by oil, coal, and chemical industry. It's not captive by pharma. And it came back with an honest study, and it said in 1989, it's a red line. This tsunami started in 89. And in 89, a lot of these other injuries suddenly appeared that we now see that are now, when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, 60% do. And it's the biggest bill on our national budget. It's 5 times the military budget. The bill for chronic disease, $4.3 trillion a year. And all these other chronic diseases appeared on the same timeline. Food allergies. If you're my age, you never knew anybody. I had 11 siblings. I had 70 first cousins. Some of them are here, I saw them. But I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Why do 5 of my 7 kids have food allergies? Something happened, right? Nobody ever saw this before. Eczema suddenly appeared, asthma, anaphylaxis, all these allergies. Asthma was around. I had a brother who had asthma. His doctor told him, there will never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare that nobody will ever study it. And today, 1 out of every black kids in New York City has asthma. All of this happened around 1989, and then all the autoimmune diseases. Juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Crohn's disease, all these exotic diseases that we never heard of that are now everywhere.
Why 1989?
Let me give you one other example. When I was a kid, the typical pediatrician would see 1 case of diabetes in his career. A 40-year career, 1 case of juvenile diabetes. Today, in America, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is pre-diabetic or diabetic. It's caused just that 1 category of disease is greater than our military budget. Nobody's saying anything about it. It's the biggest issue. Because, if our economy collapses, the dollar collapses, as the global reserve currency, we have wars, whatever. We're resilient people. We're tough. We're innovative. We're entrepreneurial. We can recover from anything. We can't recover from this. And if you have one of these lifelong diseases, your soul is crushed. You're dependent on pharma and drugs, and they never get it right. There's a whole generation of kids that are damaged today. And they're damaged in ways that we see, and they're damaged in ways that we don't see. A lot of the social awkwardness and all that, which is characteristic of vaccine injury and other injuries. I'm not saying this is all from vaccines. The vaccine schedule changed that year. It's not the only thing. A lot of things happened that year, and there's about 13 culprits. There's a very famous scientist, toxicologist here in New York named Phil Landrigan, who I've used as a witness in many, many of my cases. He has a claim to be the most important toxicologist in the country. He's looked at this issue and he said, there's about 13 things that it could be, but it's probably a combination of all of them. Our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup. They're glyphosate and Roundup, neonicotinoid pesticides, atrazine, which is in 63% of our water supply, PFOAs and PFASs, which I litigated on. They made a film about my case called Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo. These are the forever chemicals that are in, that are flame retardants. They put in all of our furniture that year. They put it in our children's pajamas.
You keep saying, so that's 89.
Around that timeline, high fructose corn syrup, cell phone rated Wi-Fi radiation, fluoride is part of it, but it doesn't really follow the timeline. But these are all of these chemicals operate along the same biological pathways. So it's probably accumulation of these that injures people, and the kids you see injured are kids who have a poor mitochondrial function. So the mitochondria are the energy centers of their cells, and you can stress them so much and they will recover. But if you stress them too much, they collapse, and then there's a cascading effect that results in severe brain damage. And these kids are probably just hitting one too many exposure. And but anyway, the vaccine. What happened with vaccines is in 1986, the vaccine. When I was a kid, I had 3 vaccines, and I was fully compliant. My kids have 72 vaccines. Today, this generation is going to have 79 because of the COVID vaccine, the annual COVID vaccine. And the big change was 1989. And what happened was, in the late 70s, they created a new vaccine called the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And that vaccine was very reactogenic. A lot of kids were getting injured. 1 out of every 300 kids was dying or having permanent brain damage. The Wyeth, which was the biggest producer, went to the Reagan White House and said to Reagan, and by the way, my uncle, the Democrats were also, my uncle was head of the health committee. He was part of this too. And they went to him and said, we're losing $20 in downstream liability for every dollar that we make in profits, and we're all going to get out of the vaccine business unless you give us blanket immunity from liability. Reagan went along with it, and they passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, and all of a sudden these companies were immune from liability. Well, the biggest cause for every medicine is downstream liability, is the injuries that they cause, that you have to pay them off. So now they had this product where you're immune from that. And and there's a couple of other things about that product. One, vaccines were exempt from the very beginning from safety studies. So it's the only medical product that is not safety tested before use. Every other medical product has to have placebo-controlled trials that are 5 or 7 years because you have side effects that have long diagnostic horizons, long incubation periods, so you have to watch what happens for a long period of time. Vaccines are exempt. Why? Because the vaccine program was developed by the Public Health Service, which was CDC's predecessor agency, and the Public Health Service is a military agency. It's one of the 5 uniformed military services. That's why they have ranks like Surgeon General. And the vaccine program was developed as a national security defense against biological attacks against our country. So they wanted to make sure if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly formulate a vaccine and deploy it to 280 million Americans with no regulatory impediments. And they said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to do a 5 or 7 year safety test. So let's call it something else. We'll call it biologic, and we will exempt biologics from safety testing.
What year are we is this Dick Cheney?
No, that was much, much earlier. This is how it evolved from, the smallpox vaccines and the polio vaccines, et cetera. None of them ever had to be tested for safety. So they were tested for efficacy. Do they prevent the disease? Yes. But are there other bad things that happen? We don't know. So you don't know the risk profile. And so none of them were subjected. And then the third advantage they had, so that the exempt from safety testing saves them $250 million. And they have another huge advantage, which is they don't have to do any advertising or marketing because the federal government is ordering 76 million kids to consume the product. So they have an automatic market. So then also, NIH makes them and formulates them, and then they give them to the pharmaceutical industry. So every step of the economy, it is the perfect product. And there was a gold rush to put more and more vaccines on the schedule to mandate them to kids, because if you can get it mandated, it's $1 billion guaranteed profit for you. So all of these companies, the 4 big companies, all of them, were committing criminal acts in their other parts of their business, Vioxx and all this. They killed 500,000 people knowingly and had to pay $7 billion in criminal penalties. The same company, with this product, they can never get caught. They can never be held
I want to
liable.
cut to the chase. What you're describing sounds to me like evil. When you're talking about human beings knowingly doing what you're talking about, knowing they're going to make money and being willing to get away with it, in the interest of time, I'll just call that evil. Were you?
Upton Sinclair.
I did not expect people to bring up Upton Sinclair. I want to be honest. But go ahead.
He said something very wise, which is useful, which is that it's very hard to persuade a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. We all, as human beings, have the capacity for self-delusion, and we can convince ourselves that what we're doing is saving lives, and that maybe there's a few necessary collateral damage. But we're saving millions of people from polio and measles and smallpox. So the people who complain about it have to be silenced and gaslit. And it's probably not that many anyway.
There's a continuum.
Yeah, there's a continuum.
When we're talking about people in the industry. Since you wrote a book about Anthony Fauci, let me ask you, do you think that he genuinely believes that what he has done is a good thing?
One of the things I did with that book, and what I try to do with all of my writing, is I never look into his head. So I don't know. Well, I don't know how conscious he is, but what I show is what he did. And it's clear that he knew what he was doing on many of these was wrong, because he then would go up afterwards and actively deceive people and cover it up. So, but I can't tell exactly what's going on in his head or Bill Gates' head. I can tell you that he played this extraordinary role in history, which was as the architect of the capture of one of the greatest federal agencies in American history and world history. NIH was the premier scientific agency, research agency on Earth. When I was growing up, it was revered all around the world, and it was gold standard medicine, and it was very careful, and it had people like Bernice Eddy, these great heroes of science and medicine, and only America had that. There's no other nation in the world that had anything like NIH. I lived 10 minutes from NIH when I was a kid. There was a scientist who was married to a woman who worked for my mother, and I wanted to be a scientist when I was growing up, so I would go to NIH all the time and look through the microscopes and see the mice and the rats and the guinea pigs in the cages, and that was just fascinating to me. What happened in 1980, we passed a law called the Bayh-Dole Act, and it was about the time that Anthony Fauci, almost exactly the time that he took over NIH. He'd been there since '68. He took over in '80, and the Bayh-Dole Act said that scientists who work for NIH and NIH itself, if they assist in researching a drug that then becomes profitable, they can collect royalties on it. So, for example, the Moderna vaccine is owned by NIH, 50%. Oh, half the profits from Moderna go to NIH, and there are 6 individuals at NIH who make $150,000 a year forever. They're the high-level individuals who have margin rights for the patents. And so, that kind of relationship destroyed NIH. And NIH became the biggest incubator for pharmaceutical products. It stopped doing real science, and it just develops products for the companies. I think in 2016, there were 220 new drugs approved by FDA, and 100% of them came out of NIH. So you have, and people there are making money on it. And these are the regulators that are supposed to be looking for problems in the products to protect our health. If they're paying their mortgage on that, they're buying their boats, they're putting their kids through school, they're paying their alimony.
Greed, it's hard to pretend like it's okay. I mean, everybody wants money, everybody wants to get a pension, but what you're describing has done unspeakable evil to many, many human beings. And you, it seems to me that you're part of the answer to the second part of the question. Where did this come from that you were willing to speak out against these kinds of things? Was your awareness of this?
And by that, you mean...
for you to become outspoken on
what
this.
What inclined me, or what discovery was it that made me say, hey, the building is burning down? Is that what you're saying?
Not just that, but to be willing to be called, to be vilified, to be called a conspiracy theorist by, the entire establishment, to be willing to suffer those slings and arrows, why were you willing to do that? Was it just a sense that it was right and that you had to be a voice for those people?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One is, I think I was raised in a milieu where, you were, I've told this story before, but my dad, about 2 weeks before he died, my dad gave me this book to read by Camus, which is called The Plague. And it's about a doctor.
That's not a typical dad move.
No. But
you're aware.
I know, but he would give me periodically books to read or poems to read. But he gave me this book with a special intensity. He said, you need to read this. Oh, I never read it before he died, and after he died, I read it several times in order to kind of decode, what the message was that it seemed like an important message that he was trying to give me. The book is about a medical doctor in a quarantine city in Northern Europe, and there's a plague ravaging the city, very, very high infection fatality rate. Nobody knows how to treat it, and a lot of the beginning of the book is the doctor having a conversation in his own head. Should I go out of my apartment? Because if I do, I'm probably going to die. I'm not going to be able to help anybody anyway. So isn't it just the most prudent thing to lock myself in here and wait this out? And eventually he goes out and he does his job consoling people, etc. And Camus was an existentialist. He was the legatee of the ideology of Stoicism, which was a Greek and Roman philosophy, a very, very beautiful approach to life, and that my father really was heavily influenced by after the death of his brother. My father was always a Roman Catholic. In order to process his brother's death and to make sense of this disorderly universe, he began exploring other philosophies. He read the Greeks. He read Edith Hamilton. He read the poets. He read Shakespeare and a lot of existentialists. And he really integrated Stoicism into his own character. And the kind of iconic hero of Stoicism is Sisyphus. And Sisyphus was a man who had done a favor for humanity that had displeased the gods. They cursed him to push a boulder up the hill all day long, every day for eternity. And his job was to push it over the hill, but he could never get over the top. when he got to the top of the hill, just before he pushed it over, it would roll back on him and mangle him, and then roll down the hill. And he'd spend all night long walking back down the hill to the boulder, and then he'd push it up again. And in the view of many people, Sisyphus would have been a miserable person. But in the view of the Stoics, he was an insanely happy man because he had a job, he knew what it was, and he put his shoulder to the stone.
Did Camus write a book called The Myth of Sisyphus?
Yeah, and he wrote about Sisyphus Smiles. And it was, the message was that, you know, life is not supposed to be easy. Life is supposed to be hard, but that out of that hardship, that pain is the touchstone for spiritual growth. That we do not grow without a hardship, without discipline, and that in doing and taking our own task and performing that task, even if it's unpleasant, even if you're surrounded by people who don't like you or hate you or deride you, that you're bringing order to a chaotic universe, and you're kind of throwing down a gauntlet at the gods, at the absurdity of life, and you're bringing order to it, and you're bringing ultimately a kind of joy to it.
I thought you were going someplace when you mentioned that your father gave you the Plague by Camus. That's the book that he gave you. And that you were going to say something about the plague or whatever. But also, I should interject.
Well, Camus, I followed Camus to try to figure
right. Now,
out.
What almost no one knows, and it's in the book that I gave to you, published by Skyhorse, our mutual publisher, also Woody Allen's. Camus, at the end of his life, became a Christian. No one knows this, and I talk about it in my book. Just a note. But to go back to what you're saying, because there's so much here, there are nefarious, forces at work. The way they have tried to silence you on these issues, what many of us have lived through in the last, since COVID, it's dark stuff. But I think that as a result of what happened very recently with COVID, a lot of people have woken up, and a lot of people have begun to ask questions. And I think that what we today might call the deep state, I mean, the vast bureaucracy that insists that you go along with a certain narrative, Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And it seems to me, just going back to kind of where you got some of your instincts from to stand against this, it seems to me that your uncle and to some extent your father were in the 60s at war with these forces. And I think you have said that you believe that the CIA was involved in your uncle's murder. I mean, most of us grew up in a world where we kind of thought, that's probably conspiracy theory. It's too complicated. We'll just go along with it. Yeah, the Warren Commission's probably wrong, but we don't want to go there. But in more recent years, people like me, I think increasingly have gone there and have said, what's going on? What's the narrative beneath the narrative? We've been told this and this and this, and I think more people are waking up to that. More people are receptive to the idea that if the medical establishment says take that jab or that vaccine or whatever, that maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should think for yourself. Maybe you should be careful what you eat. So I want to go back to the murder of your uncle. At what point did you realize what we're talking about? Because I just want to say, as a patriotic American, the idea that there be forces in our own government capable of that, very, very hard to process. At what point did you begin to think about that?
Well, I'll say something about this, that Eisenhower gave that speech on January 17th, 1961. It was my birthday. It was 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, which I was present for. Eisenhower didn't do that on my birthday deliberately. And
they're not having the debate on my birthday deliberately.
It was his farewell address,
Yeah.
but it was this extraordinary speech. And incidentally, if you read that speech, it was very short. And he warned the emergence of a military-industrial complex, that it would subvert democracy and destroy all of our values and destroy our country from within. In the next paragraph, he said, and equally bad, the rise of a federal medical scientific establishment that would destroy public health and erode, the credibility of science, et cetera. It's very, very prescient and really brilliant speech. And to me, it should be required reading for every kid in this, a school kid. My uncle spent 3 years battling his military-industrial complex, refusing to go to war. He refused to send troops to Laos. He refused to, in '61, he refused to send troops during the Bay of Pigs in '61. He refused in '62 to go into Berlin in the Checkpoint Charlie crisis. He refused to go into Cuba again in '62 or '63 in the missile crisis, and then he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam. He ended up, they wanted 250,000 combat troops, and he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And then he ended up sending 16,000 advisors who weren't allowed to participate in combat. He found out in October, they did anyway, they mainly Green Berets and helicopter pilots. He found out on October 22nd, 1962, he learned that a Green Beret had died. He asked Walt Rostow for a casualty list, and Rostow came back and said, 75 men have died. And he said, that's too many, we're bringing them all home. That afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all US military personnel out of Vietnam, with the first 1,000 coming back the following in December. 30 days to the day that he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week later, President Johnson remanded that order and ended up sending 250,000 troops. My father ran against the war in '68. He was killed during that campaign, and then Nixon came in and sent 560,000, and 56,000 never came home, including George Skakel, who's over here. We have another cousin called George Skakel who died in the Tet Offensive, so he was one of the people who never came home. But my uncle, you asked when I first occurred to me. It occurred to me while I was standing in the East Room of the White House in November 24th, 1963, with my uncle's casket. And President Johnson came in and said that the person who killed my uncle, Lee Harvey Oswald, had just been shot and murdered in the police station by a man named Jack Ruby. And when Johnson turned around, I was with my mother, with Jackie, and my father at the time. I turned to my mom and I said, why did he do that? Did he love our family? So my brain was already, this doesn't make any sense. And later it turned out that he was a gun runner for the mob, and was involved in the Cuba operations, et cetera. Now, I won't try to convince anybody that the CIA killed my uncle. There's 100 books on it, at least. The best book, an extraordinary scholar who does a really good job at distilling all of the millions of pages of research. I think at least 30 people who were involved directly in the murder have made full confessions, a lot of them on their deathbeds. And the person who distills that, I think, better than any of the other books is Jim Douglas in his book, which is called The Unspeakable. So anybody who's curious about that and you want to just read one book, that would be, to me, the book to read. My father, and then, the CIA has for 60 years prevented the release of the documents. And we know the agents involved. We know Bill Harvey was involved. We know David Atlee Phillips. We know exactly what they were doing. And then there's things that we don't know, but E. Howard Hunt, who made a full confession, deathbed confession, and many others. My father's death, I always assumed was that Sirhan killed my father. He made a full confession, and he was then, there were 77 eyewitnesses, and so it never, ever occurred to me that he did not kill my dad. And then a guy called Paul Schrade, who was a union leader, he was the number 3 guy at the UAW, the United Auto Workers, a very close friend with my father. He had recruited Cesar Chavez to the labor movement, and Cesar Chavez became one of my father's closest personal and friends and political allies. And Paul Schrade was standing next to my father when he was shot, and Paul took the first bullet in his head. He lived to be 95 years old, and he died about 2 years ago. And the last 20 years of his life, he was fighting to get Sirhan out of jail. He asked me to come to his house and read the autopsy report, which, believe me, was the last thing I wanted to do. But because of his closeness to my father and because of the sacrifice he made, I ultimately went there and I sat down at his kitchen table and read this report. And that was the first time it occurred to me that Sirhan had not killed my father. And the autopsy report by Thomas Noguchi was the most important coroner in American history. That autopsy is known as the perfect autopsy because Noguchi knew what had happened in Dallas, where there was all this, screwy stuff with the autopsies. And he was determined that would not happen in Los Angeles. So he invited the chief coroner of all the branches of the armed service to observe, and other famous coroners to observe his autopsy. And they were all in the theater at that time, and he did this autopsy that is extraordinary. And what he found was that Sirhan was waiting for my father in front of a steam table in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. It was a route my father was not supposed to have taken. He was supposed to go out through the ballroom, but someone led him through the kitchen and directly into this ambush. Sirhan was waiting and fired 2 shots at my father. The first shot hit Paul Schrade. The second shot hit a door jamb behind my father at head level and was later removed by the LAPD. He was then grabbed by 6 men, including the 1960 decathlon champion Rayford Johnson, who was one of my father's best friend, Roosevelt Greer, who was one of the fearsome foursome, and a number of other people. They grabbed him and they pointed his gun. They grabbed his hand first and bent him over the steam table. So he was on the steam table on his back, and they forced his arm away from my dad. Rayford Johnson later told me, although Sirhan is a tiny little guy, he had superhuman strength and that he could not pry the pistol from his hand. And Sirhan squeezed off 6 more shots and emptied the gun. Only eight, it was a revolver with only 8 shots in it. He never reloaded. All 6 of those shots hit people. So we know what happened to every shot in the gun. The audios show 14 shots being fired. My father was killed by 4 shots from behind. Sirhan was always 5 feet in front of him. And there was 77 eyewitnesses that he was always in front of me. He never was behind my dad.
The larger question is who, in other words...
Wait, if you give me 1 minute, I'll finish. And I think I'm going to answer your question. All of those shots, according to Noguchi, were contact shots, meaning that the shots were, the gun was touching my father's body and left a carbon tattoo. And they were fired from behind. The man who was standing there was a man named Eugene Cesar, who was the security guard who had led my father into the ambush. And he had one hand, his right hand was, or his left hand was holding my father's left elbow. He was standing behind him, and he had his gun drawn. He was witness with it. My father, when he fell, And I was with my dad when he died. When he fell backwards onto Cesar, and Cesar was on the floor below him. And my father must have known that he was being shot from behind, because the last thing he did was reach around and pull off Cesar's clip-on tie. And the photographs of my father on the floor have him with that clip-on tie in his hand. And Cesar then pushed him off and got up with his gun drawn, which everybody saw. He later told the police that he had been firing at Sirhan, but nobody ever saw that. There's no evidence of that. My father was shot 4 times. One of the shots went through his shoulder pad harmlessly and into the ceiling. The other shots were, fatal. The worst shot was the one behind his ear, but it left a carbon tattoo. And there's a recent book about Eugene Cesar. I had communications with Eugene Cesar, who died during COVID. But I was talking to him at that time and seeing if I could come visit him. He'd moved to the Philippines. He was an avowed racist. He hated my family. He had gotten the job 2 days before as a security guard at a security company, and had never been employed as a security guard before. His real job was at the Lockheed and formerly the Hughes airline plants in Los Angeles, which are CIA operations. Lisa Pease, who's done the most thorough book on my dad's murder, found documentation where Cesar identifies himself as a CIA agent. So I don't know, and I can't say there's, Well,
the larger question, because I don't think anybody here would dispute what you're saying. The larger question is, who is so interested in keeping this information from coming out? In other words, we're talking about extraordinarily dark forces in our own government that are operating to this day, it seems to me. And it seems that's part of your passion in doing what you do, even running for president. Do you have any sense that this swamp could be drained? Any sense that that these forces could be exposed? Whether we're talking about the NIH, whether we're talking about the CIA, it's dramatic to think that our tax dollars are funding this kind of thing. And I think many Americans are rather recently waking up to what we're dealing with. You called at some point for the end of NATO. There seems to be an awakening that the narrative that we've gone along with is one that we've been duped, basically, and that we need to have a deeper understanding of things than we've had, basically. But what is your sense of whether it's possible? Is this utterly quixotic, or is there any sense that it's possible for us to, uncover some of these bad actors and call them to account?
Yeah, I'm very confident if I'm elected president that I can dismantle the deep state. And the reason that I feel uniquely able to do it is because it really, you're seeing this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that includes the military-industrial complex, includes the pharmaceutical industry, but includes all of these other industries that have captured the agencies that are supposed to regulate them. Those agencies have become sock puppets for the industries they're supposed to regulate, and the CIA is a captive agency of the military-industrial complex. They're not working for you and me. They're working for Raytheon and General Dynamics and Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and BlackRock, which owns all of those companies and owns Pfizer. BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard own 88% of the S&P 500, and they own all the pharma, including the 3 major owners of BlackRock. They're the same people who control the Fed, and they control all of the, they've got the contracts not only to destroy Ukraine, but the contracts to rebuild Ukraine. BlackRock's got all those contracts now that Biden signed with them. And so they're doing it right in front of us, right? And they don't even care that we know about it anymore. But I've spent 40 years litigating against these agencies, and each of the agencies have their own unique cultures and their own unique problems and their own captors. But I have been thinking about for 40 years how to unravel that corporate capture. The most difficult one's the CIA. The person who's running my campaign is Amaryllis Fox, who's, somebody told me it was my daughter-in-law. Somebody said to me the other day, she is the smartest woman I've ever met. And I said, no, she's the smartest person you've ever met. And she's absolutely brilliant, but she spent her life in the CIA, came out, went there idealistically after 9/11, served as a spy in the weapons of mass destruction program, saw the real role of the CIA, and has spent the rest of her life fighting against it and fighting to dismantle the state. My father was very acutely aware of this problem. My uncle had tried to appoint my father as head of the CIA because he said it is a problem. My uncle famously realized during the Bay of Pigs invasion that Alan Dulles and George Bissell and Richard Bissell and George Cabell, who was the military leader of the CIA, had all lied to him. And that they knew that the men were going to die on the beach, and they were hoping that that would make him send the Essex, the aircraft carrier, and he refused. And he came out of that meeting in the middle of the night, and he said to his aide, he publicly took blame for the Bay of Pigs invasion, but privately he said to his aides, I want to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter it to the winds. And then he tried to appoint my father. My grandfather told him he couldn't do it. He said, it's a very dangerous precedent to have the brother of the President of the United States running this secret police organization. You can't do it. So they brought in a very pious Catholic, John McCone, who was a Republican business guy who they thought would have, because of his real moral center, that he would be able to change the culture of the agency. I was with Mike Pompeo, a very strange dinner that I had about 2 months ago with Mike Pompeo, Hillary Clinton, Karl Rove, Bill Baer, Boris Johnson, the 5 of us at a table. And really the weirdest dinner I've ever had in my life. But Mike Pompeo said to me, and I never liked Mike Pompeo.
Excuse me, who put this dinner together?
Mike Pompeo said to me, and I never liked Mike Pompeo because I thought he's just a warmonger, but
is that true?
I got to like him personally because he's really smart. He's very, very thoughtful. He has a very, very different view of America's role in the world than me, but I thought that he was very sincere and very patriotic. He said to me during that meal, he said, my biggest regret in life is that I did not fix the CIA. And he said, I had an opportunity and I didn't do it. And then he said, the entire upper echelon of that agency are made up of individuals that do not believe in the democratic institutions of the United States of America. Oh, my father saw the same thing. My uncle saw the same thing. My father had a plan for fixing the CIA, which which is the same plan that will work today, which is to separate the espionage division from the plans division. Espionage we need. That's information gathering and analysis. The plans division is the dirty tricks division. They are assassinating leaders, fixing elections, coup d'etats, all of this stuff that's gotten us into a mess all over the world. And the fact that those two are married and allows the plans division to spy on us and to control, all of control the narrative before and after their actions is really what has made them so, so dangerous. And those two functions need to be separated. As it turns out, the last tranche of documents that was released from the Kennedy assassination papers, Trump promised he'd release them, he didn't. Why? if you ever get him up here, you should say to him, why did you not release him? Because he promised he would. Biden promised he'd release him, and he wouldn't. He didn't. The last tranche that was released included a document that was written by Dick Goodwin and Arthur Schlesinger, two of my uncle's most trusted aides, about how to dismantle the CIA, and it's almost exactly what my father had planned to do. It's what I'll do when I get into office. So I think, yeah.
On the off chance that you're not elected in November, and that Donald Trump is elected, would you be willing to work for him in some capacity to do what you're talking about?
I don't think so. I mean, I would listen to a proposal, but I don't think so. I don't think.
You wouldn't serve your country?
Well, I'm not confident that I could do that. If I had that confidence, I would. I think. I don't think. Anyway.
What you've been talking about. I mean, the backstory, because we don't have the time, but we're talking about America. And when I interviewed your cousin, Caroline Kennedy, at one point we were talking about how your uncle, Teddy, would exhort you cousins to memorize Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. And it reminded me of a different America, because when people talk about, say, I'm a Kennedy Democrat, that's pretty dramatically different than what the party has become. There was a love of country, and I think that when you talk about your uncle's desire, your father's desire to right these wrongs, there's something noble about that, and it's hard not to admire that. And to think that we're 6 decades along and that we're still dealing with this stuff. Most Americans still aren't awake to the narrative. I mean, you're giving us chapter and verse on where the bullets were, and most Americans think, oh, Sirhan, Lee Harvey, and again, not that that's the most important thing, but it points to the deeper truth that we're supposed to be a self-governing people, and it seems that some of the forces that you've been working against have been. They're taking great pains to demonize anybody like you that would question the narrative, and so it seems to me that you have to have hope that people are waking up. I mean, did the 51 people who signed that document denouncing the Hunter Biden laptop as Russian disinformation? I mean, I think that there are many Americans that are aware that something very nasty is going on, that we've got to do something about it. And I just think that whether you are in the White House or outside of the White House, that you're uniquely appointed to be working for this. So I'd like to think that America would mean enough to you that.
I would, first of all.
And by the way, if Biden should win, I don't think you're getting a call from him, by the way.
Yeah. No, I'm not. But I do want to just emphasize what you just said about those people here may not know what you're talking about. I think most of them do, but there were 51 high-level acting or inactive CIA officials who signed a letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, which was a lie. It was tampering with the U.S. election, what they were doing. And it was the CIA tampering with the U.S. election. And the fact that, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's, and one of the reasons that I don't think I'd go to work for him is because he offered me a job in the last administration, and then he took $1 million from Pfizer, and then.
I've heard that story, and I think a lot of us were in a different place at that time. A lot of us have a very different view of Pfizer and Moderna than we did at that point, and actually a very different view of many things than we did at that point.
When somebody looks you in the eye and tells you, I want you to do this, and then, you know, it was a big cost for me to go announce that I'm joining the Trump administration, an enormous cost. And then, you know, and then nothing is there. It makes you less willing to, you know, then entrust to trust that person again. So, you know, like I said, I would listen to a proposal. My objective is to help my country. But
well, that, you know, you know, in this day and age, to say that sincerely, it's a beautiful thing. That's why people applaud. And you know, bluntly, I don't see that coming from today's Democratic Party. I'm glad you're an independent, because it's very confusing to Americans who grew up at a time when, you know, Tip O'Neill was the face of the Democratic Party, when we could talk. And I think we're living in difficult times. I'm afraid we are out of time. Can I ask you, in closing, just to say a word about your faith journey? I know that you were at one point an atheist, and in the course of dealing with your heroin addiction, something happened. Can you say before we close?
Yeah, I mean, I was never an atheist, ever. But you know, I was raised in a deeply religious family, and I integrated that. You know, we went to church twice a day. We said the rosary at least once a day, at least. We prayed before and after meals. We read the lives of the saints or the Bible every night. And it wasn't just my 11 siblings and parents. All 29 of the cousins were raised the same way, and you know, we would all see each other at church every morning, etc. So it was a really important part of my life. But when, you know, my dad was killed when I was 14. I became a heroin addict when I was 15, and but I was always fighting my addiction. I was taking heroin without my own permission, and I was doing that for a lot of years. And when you're doing that, when you're living against conscience, which is what, you know, happens when you're an addict, you tend to push any kind of notion of God over the periphery of your horizon. So, you know, God had become a very, very small thing in my life. And then I had this, you know, I was struggling. By the way, I had very iron willpower in always from when I was a kid, and very good discipline. I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13. I never ate candy again until I was in college. And I gave up desserts for Lent when I was 14. I never had another dessert till I was in college, and I was bulking up for sport, for rugby. And I felt I could do anything with my willpower, but this compulsion, the drug compulsion, was just impervious to it, and it was cunning, baffling, and demoralizing. And to me, the most demoralizing feature of addiction was my incapacity to keep contracts with myself. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm never going to do that again. And at 4 o'clock, I'd be doing it. And it was baffling to me that I could not bind that person who I was going to be later on in the day to do anything. And I knew when I got sober that I had to change in a deep, fundamental way who I was. And because I didn't want to be an addict, but just be white-knuckling it and be miserable all the time and wanting a drug. And I wanted to be just wake up and not want any drugs. And I knew that was going to require a spiritual awakening. I knew from reading the lives of the saints that there had been people who had been living in all kinds of depravity. St. Augustine was one, St. Francis another, who had these spiritual awakenings and just walked away from addiction. And I had a friend who was a friend of my little brother who died of this disease, David, who was a year difference than me. And he took heroin the same way I did, with the same enthusiasm and compulsion. He became a Mooney. He joined the Unification Church and became a follower of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And he didn't want to take drugs anymore. And he used to still hang out with us, and we would take drugs right in front of him, but he was zero interest. He was completely indifferent to him. And he would chatter about all of his stuff from the Unification Church. And when I got sober in September of '83, I would think about this guy all the time, and I'd think, I'd rather be dead than be a Mooney. That's what I was thinking at that time. But I wish somehow I could distill whatever it was he had that made him, impervious to this compulsion without becoming a religious nuisance. And at that time, I read a book by Carl Jung called Synchronicity, and the short story is that in that book, he tries to use empirical tools and scientific tools to prove the existence of a God. And he fails. But he says in that book that although he can't scientifically prove the existence of a God, that he could prove that he ran the biggest sanitarium in Europe in Zurich, and he said he could prove, having seen tens of thousands of patients come through his facility, that people who believed in God got better faster than people who didn't, and that their recovery was more durable. And for me, that was a more impactful thing than if he had said that he had proved the existence of a God, which I wouldn't have believed. But what he was saying was that it's irrelevant if there's a God up there. If you believe in one, your chances of staying sober are much better. And I'd already made a commitment to myself that I'd do whatever I needed to do to improve my chances of staying sober by even 1%. So I made a decision, just an intellectual decision. I'm going to start believing in God, and recover what I had lost. And then I was presented with the dilemma that anybody who's in that position would face, which is, how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or touch or taste or hear or acquire with your senses? And Jung solves that problem. He says, you fake it till you make it. He said, act as if. And he said, the obedience will precede the evidence. In other words, if you start doing what you're supposed to do, that you will then see an evidence of tangible, undeniable evidence of God's presence in your life. And so I started doing that. I just said, oh, that's what I'm going to do. And I just started pretending that, that there was a God up there watching me all the time, and that everything I did in life was a test. And that, I began breaking my day down into about 40 different decisions. And each of those decisions now, for me, had a moral implication. When the alarm goes off in the morning, do I get immediately out of bed, or do I stay in bed for an extra 20 minutes with my indolent thoughts? Do I make the bed? Most important thing I do during the decision I do every day. Do I hang up the towels, after I use them? Do I, when I reach into the closet and pull out a pair of blue jeans and all those little wire hangers fall on the ground, do I shut the door like I used to and say, I'm too much of a big shot, that's somebody else's job? Or do I go in there and clean up my own mess? Do I put the water back in the ice tray before I put the ice tray in the freezer? Do I put the shopping cart where it's supposed to go? And I had this experience when I first got sober. When you're an addict, your life gets very small. But as soon as I got sober, my life started to enlarge dramatically. And I was running about 2 months after, into it. I was running through National Airport in Washington, D.C., and I was late for a plane, and it was mission critical. It was going to be the apocalypse if I didn't catch that plane. And I was certainly going to miss, almost certainly to miss it. And as I ran, I was putting a stick of Dentyne in my mouth, and I wrapped up the little wrapper into a ball, and I threw the wrapper, and it made a perfect arch as I was running into the center of a garbage can. And swish right in. But as I was running by it, I saw out of the corner of my eye, it must have hit something in there because it jumped back out. And I was like, well, that's God's problem because I made the shot. I got about 40 feet from that trash can. It just started eating at me. And finally, I put on the brakes, and I went back, and I threw it in the garbage can. And for me, that's probably the most important thing I did that day, because the big challenge in holding, after you have a spiritual awakening, you can't live off the laurels of a spiritual awakening. You have to, and I had a spiritual awakening that just abolished my desire for drugs and alcohol. But you can't live off the laurels. You have to renew it every day. You have to renew it to display service to others, and you have to renew it by staying in that posture of surrender. I came in a total surrender, my life gone, and was willing at that point to turn my life over to God. But then when the cash and prizes start flowing back in, you're like, thanks God, I got it from here. And then, you take the wheel and drive the car off the cliff again, and then you have to come in on your knees. And the big trick is, how do you stay in that posture of surrender even when your life is filling with abundance, And so.
Are you still pretending that God exists?
Yeah, I don't pretend anymore, because Jung says in his book, Jung never had any doubt of God. Jung saw God everywhere, and with such clarity, and with such texture and grace and joy and just material existence. He didn't even understand what it was like to not have faith. His father had been a preacher, but a dry preacher. His father had been a very important preacher, but he never believed it. He was very good at sort of reciting the conventional shibboleths, but he never had an authentic religious experience. And Jung had those experiences from when he was 3 years old. His biography is just riveting, which is called Memories, Dreams, and Something Remembrances. But he wrote it when he was 86 years old. And his recitation of these experiences that he had from when he was a kid are fascinating. And, he was, Freud was his mentor. And Freud was a total atheist. And they did a tour of America together by train. It's a fascinating book because they ended up splitting on that issue. And Freud really made himself irrelevant, whereas Jung today is, everywhere. Because his approach to healing was all about kind of spiritual connections.
It's very frustrating that we're more than out of time, but I'd like to think that this might be the first of a number of conversations. It's been a privilege. Thank you, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you.
Really great. Thank you.
Thank you.